Transitioning a church. That's been one of the things that I've done over the last little while, for most of my adult life, and now I help pastors in lots of different parts of the world, especially in North America. Transitioning a church from a ministerial model, a model that is defined by Sunday, and a model that is defined by an attraction to a celebration event on a Sunday, into a more dynamic, more member-led missional focus is a highly complex and difficult thing to do. Changing culture is perhaps the most complicated and difficult thing any leader can be called to take on. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the change of culture. And if you're going to change a culture, the single most important thing that you can do is to change language. Language creates culture. Now, we've been saying this within our movement for probably 20 years. Recently, social anthropology, recent textbooks that have been used in university studies. One that just springs to mind, cross-cultural communication, which is a series of contributors led by Professor Samovar, who's probably the world's best-known social anthropologist. They would all not only concur with that statement, but they would demonstrate it with measurable fact. Culture is created by language. So if you change the language, you will change the culture. Now, I'll tell you in a moment how it was that the Lord showed me how to begin to change the language in a given context that helped us make the transition towards a missional focus and a missional outlook, and then really into a missional movement from a fairly well-established Attractional church. But before we get there, let's just look at what it is that we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a need within our ecclesial context to create a continuum that recognizes that attraction and mission are two ends of the same reality. They're not exclusive components, they're not separate categories, but they are a place on a continuum of reality that most of us live in. There is no missional community that is able to do any effective missional work that is not attractive also. It's impossible for any missional community that is being effective not to be attractive. Attraction and mission are part of the same continuum. And what we're doing really by transitioning a church is recognizing that, being intentional with it, and stretching the continuum beyond the boundaries from which we have generally operated. So we're saying, yes, this church that is largely functioning around an attractional model, around an attractional ministry, does have a missional component to it. We're just going to enhance that missional component, extend it, and be more intentional about it. If you look at the principal model churches of the Acts of the Apostles, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Ephesus, there are elements both of the attractional and missional in each of those three model churches. And if in your study of those three churches you overlay one upon the other, you begin to get a picture, I believe, of something of what it is that God intends for the church in North America and the church everywhere else. The first time that the church is represented in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 2, immediately after the conversion of 3,000. the church is described as being on a specific continuum. I'll just read that out. In Acts chapter 2, verse 42, of course, we know that the New Testament describes the kind of the culture and the way in which the church lived out its reality. But here in verse 46, after it describes how they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, the fellowship, breaking bread and prayer, it goes on to say this in Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, verse 46 says this: every day, they, that is, all of the new believers, continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. There was a dual context for the very first church. And those of you who were present yesterday in the pre-conference will know that the home, the New Testament Greek word oikos, the household, was the missional vehicle that God used to change the world over the first 250 years of the church's life. That missional vehicle is now expressed in 21st century terms in missional communities. The oikos, the household, the mid-sized missional community is basically what the New Testament church used to change the world by flying under the radar of the contemporary culture and bringing the gospel to the neighborhoods that they were able to impact. But as they began, they always had a public context in which they as a church functioned. And where it was thank you for that. And where it was possible because of the absence of persecution, it appears that the church generally found a public context in which to operate. So Paul, when he's speaking to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20, describes his ministry as being a ministry held in public and from house to house, from oikos to oikos. So Paul is describing a continuum of mission and ministry that is descriptive both in the public realm, that can be easily observed, and in sociological terms, the social space of the oikos, of the household. Now, what we're seeking to do in transition most of the time is dealing with the reality that this is 9/10 of people's experience at minimum. So this is at least 90%, if not more, of what it means for them to be a Christian. And we're seeking to get them over here. And so the transition is transitioning away from a temple mentality, away from an attractional mentality, not so that we leave it completely, but so that we can live in a broader continuum of experience and be able to engage with more than what it is that we currently engage with. Now, from a historical point of view, this has been represented in most eras of the church's life when the church has been especially effective in mission. One of the times that's least recognized is the time of the early Middle Ages. I alluded to this yesterday just briefly. In the early Middle Ages, the Romans returned to Great Britain. Around about the 5th century, as you know, the Roman Empire retreated from its frontier positions in northern Europe, and one of those places was Britain. It retreated from Britain and left Britain to the native tribes, who were largely Celtic tribes. And the expectation was that these barbarians would mess everything up. Well, of course, to some extent they did, because they didn't know how to use the buildings and they just kind of tore them down. But within a couple of hundred years, the Romans returned, not as military conquerors, but as missionaries. The first Archbishop of Canterbury, Augustine, not of Hippo, but of Canterbury, about 400 years difference between the two of them, so it's definitely not the same person. Augustine turns up, and what he does is what the Romans always have done, either as a military force or as a missional force. They built a building and then expected everything to happen on the basis of them building a building. It was called Canterbury Cathedral. It's still there. It's all very nice. And, we're grateful that they did it. But their theory was this: if you build it, they will come. What they encountered over the next 100 years was a group of wild, radical, missionary people called the Celts, whose raison d'etre, whose axiom to life was not if you build it, they will come, but if you'll go, you will reach them. And so the Celts spread out from the outer reaches of the British Isles, got into tiny coracles, which are just circular, skin-covered boats, maybe 8 feet across, and head out across the North Sea, one of the most unpredictable and difficult tracts of sea in the world, and went into Northern Europe. They evangelized the Franks, the Germanic tribes, all of the people that were absolutely terrifying to everybody else in the world. They just went out and got them. As the Romans and the Celts connected with one another, something amazing happened. What happened was a missionary movement was created that transformed barbarian Europe into the breadbasket of mission for 1,000 years. The reason we're here today is because they did something special. And what they did was to create the Minster movement. And the Minster movement was basically temple and home, attraction and mission, Roman and Celtic. Somehow, in this at times uneasy alliance, the spiritualities of these two different groups were melded together to form one of the most dynamic missionary movements the world has ever seen. And it was the Minster movement that spread out through Europe, building, at first out of wood and then out of stone, large centers for celebration, teaching, training, and healing that would send out missionary teams into the uncharted wilderness who were like strawberry plants, always connected back to the mother church, and yet living with a degree of autonomy in the mission that they exercised. And really through that, the parish system of Europe was created, and the thousands of churches and the millions of people that came to Christ through that process. That Minster process, that Minster movement, was really a kind of a contemporary expression of what it was that the early church attempted to do when persecution allowed them to do it. What it is that I've been fortunate to be able to do in my calling is to be able to lead a church through that process. And what it is that Alex is currently doing is doing precisely that with another church here on American soil, and many other people in this room are also doing. The two things that are necessary for you to focus on at the outset are culture, which means language, and secondly, leadership, which means the people who are capable of taking the vision forward. And simply, the way to change the language is this: begin including into the language, in a deliberate and intentional fashion, an outward perspective. and an outward vocabulary. For me, I simply used the three words up, in, and out. We began to describe what an upward relationship was as an individual and as a church, which all of you know about through scripture, prayer, worship. We described what it meant for an inward relationship to be described within the covenant relationships of God's people. And then the outward relationship was begun to be described both in biblical and contemporary language, so as to help us understand what it meant for us to have an outward perspective and an outward movement. And as we began to include the words up, in, and out, it became impossible for people to do things that didn't reference that language. So within a couple of years, people would visit me and they'd say to me, "What is it, this thing that people keep on saying, they want to do an out? It sounds a bit weird to me." I said, it does sound a bit weird, but what it's actually indicating is that they're beginning to turn their attitudes, their minds and their hearts towards the mission field and away from exclusively looking at the ministry of the local church. And simply by doing that, there are many other ways in which we enhanced and developed the language. Simply by doing that, the culture gradually became capable of turning towards a new direction. So that was the first thing. The second thing was this: leaders. And with leaders, it was absolutely essential for me to identify who the L50s were. In other words, these were the leaders who were capable of leading 50 people in a missional community. If you spend enough time looking at a larger group of people, whether there's 50 there or not, you will begin to see the gravitational fields of influence that function in any group of people that suggest to you who the leaders are. They're the leaders that God has created to be leaders. One of the best illustrations for this was from the Korean War. The American brass could not understand how it was possible that so many American personnel could be held captive by so few North Korean soldiers. 2 or 3 people with rifles could hold 200 or 300 American soldiers captive in an encampment. They couldn't work it out at all. So they interviewed, I think that's in inverted commas, they interviewed a colonel from the North Korean army at the end of the war, and they said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "That was easy. What we did is, when we got all the prisoners together, we ignored rank, class, and status. We put them under heavy guard, and we observed who the natural leaders were. We removed the natural leaders and put them in solitary confinement, and everybody else was easy." It's quite possible for you to be able to observe who the natural leaders are. They're the people to focus on first, because they're the people who will pull the cart, because they're the horses. They're the strong horses that God wants you to feed. And my encouragement to you is, feed the horses, don't worry about building the cart. So identify who the leaders are and begin focusing and feeding them. Alex.
Okay, why don't we take 15 seconds just to stretch, if you need to do that. For those of you who are standing, there's a chair here. If you're not too much of a hefty Harry, there's 2 of you can go on that table there, 2 on that table there, and there's 2 seats here. So half a dozen of you who are standing, come and get a seat. The rest of you just say one thing you've taken from Mike to your neighbour. Just turn to your neighbour and one thing you're going to take away from what he's shared. Well,
so what he's not really done any of what we talked about.
No, I'm going to go through that. What I might do is just tell the story of what we're doing at River Tree really fast in like 5 to 10 minutes. Does that sound?
Yeah. We'll just check with Mike. Right, we're just trying to decide where we're going. He's going to tell a little bit of the story of River Tree. I'll bring it back with a diagram and say here.
I don't think you do the whole leadership pipeline this long. I'd just do a triangle.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, take it. Right. So what we recruiting leaders, change culture.
I mean, basically what you're doing is what do you do with a leader when you've got them?
Is that next or?
I think you next.
I don't mind.
No, I think we do you next.
Okay. I'll try and do it and then we can give them time to question as well.
I think the other five is.
Okay. All right. My name's Alex Absalom. I am at a church in Ohio, in Canton, Ohio, home of the Football Hall of Fame. I know, girly football with pads, but never mind. And it's a church called River Tree Church, which is actually, interestingly, a mega church that's transitioning strongly and quickly into missional communities. But I've been there since the start of the year. And before that, as you can tell, there's a acute hearing from my accent. I'm not from Ohio. And actually, before that, we were in Oklahoma. Y'all. And Boomasuna, well done. And we were there for 3.5 years doing a similar process and a journey with the church there, and obviously before that in the UK. So what I'm going to do now is kind of go, if Mike was at the big picture, I'm going to give you just some detail on some of the ways you can do this. Now, this is not meant to be the template. It's just a kind of worked out pathway, and that'll give you something to run against and push against, okay? So here's a bit of the journey that we're using at River Tree, and it's something like this. They've been on a process for a number of years, I suppose, prior to me getting there, of just realizing that the attractional mode wasn't doing it, and what does it look like to be more missional. Some tools that they use were things like what Reggie McNeil talks about in Missional Renaissance, Renaissance, and he does those three transitions from internal to external focused, from running programs to developing people, and from being church-based to kingdom-based in your leadership. And things like that can be quite helpful just in terms of shifting mindsets with people. What that does, as Mike touched upon, is it impacts the metrics you use. What is it that you're going to measure? Because that affects expectations of people like your elders or the people who you're going to be accountable to. So is it bums on seats and amount of money given on a Sunday, or is it something different? The metric that we're going to try and use at River Tree is how many people do we have in discipling relationships with us. So people who are actively wanting to follow Jesus. That doesn't mean they all know the Lord in a kind of, they've committed their life to Christ and got baptized, but they're clearly on that journey, or they're way past that point and they're actually moving to, the dynamic kingdom leaders. It's a whole spectrum, but they're in intentional discipling relationships. So that's the metrics thing. Then the next stage was journeying with the key leaders, so whether you have a board or elders or council, however you do it, just helping them to start to come on board with this shift and the culture shift that it's going to be. And we can answer more about that if you want to. Then it was starting to cast the vision in broader terms to the wider church, not with masses of detail, but just to start to talk about some of the changes, maybe perhaps with guest speakers, or maybe the stories you start to tell. Interestingly, stories are really powerful. Which stories are you going to tell about your church community or about individuals? What are the things you're going to promote? Because the things you brag about will influence the wider agenda of the church community. So are you now going to start telling stories about people who are trying to do things in a more missional mode? And my suggestion with that would be, and stories in fact flow throughout, I would encourage storytelling forever. One of the things I'd encourage you to do is don't just always pick the ones where someone walked past 5 people and healed them with their shadow. Because, great if you can do that, but actually what you want is the real kind of little nitty-gritty practical stories of someone just stepping out, doing a simple thing. I was kind to that person who looked hungry and poor, and we had a great conversation. Stories like that, because what you want is regular Joe in the church to hear that and think, oh, I could do that. And it builds faith, and then it starts to develop it further. When Hannah, my wife, and I, what we've started doing this spring is we've started to huddle the ministry staff at the church. Now, it's a big church, so we're both doing a huddle. By huddle, what we mean is that's our intentional process for developing our leaders and mission. So a huddle is a place where fundamentally you're bringing accountability and encouragement to groups of 6, 8, 10, maybe 12 people who are leaders in mission, and you're really asking two questions all the time. What is Jesus saying to you, and what are you doing in response? Which really is the basis of discipleship. I'm not going any further on that, but we huddled the leaders in order to help them become leaders of huddles further down the line. Because it's really important you create a culture which, if you're going to be low control and release lots of missional life, you need to have the high accountability part where you know that those you are releasing are doing it according to the values of the kingdom and the values that you want to promote. And Huddle gives a context where you can do that in community very efficiently with your time and very effectively. What we've started doing now is we've identified, really almost self-identified, the first generation of missional leaders, missional community leaders. And so we're actually running a pilot missional community. We're running 3 of them actually, with those groups of people. So in other words, we're giving them quite an intense immersion into what does it feel like to be in a group of, say, 30, 40 people. What is it, how do you do food? How do you worship in that context? How do you bring the word? How do you pray for one another? Those sorts of things. So they get an experience. We're also doing mission with them. Some when I say project, they're not actually hit and run. They're contexts where we're already involved and where we will see missional communities emerge. But just to help them experience doing mission in that size of group, which a lot of people have never done, and is actually a really powerful experience. And also, we're bringing training into that context of, so we're actually spending time processing with them. Well, here's some ideas on what a missional community would look like. Here's the importance of setting a mission vision. So we're in this pilot process during April and May with them. And then the plan is that we're going to publicly launch our missional communities in September, because obviously summer's kind of silly season. So we'll get them back together end of the summer, do a bit more training with them, and then we're going to publicly launch them. The way we're doing that is we're going to do a big launch weekend, basically turn our weekend services over to, it'll look like a kind of market type thing, with lots of booths and activity and life and colour and sound. And what that does is we're going to really publicly promote the different missional communities that are going to be birthed and invite members of the church to say, hey, just come and check out what's going on, have a look, ask questions, know how you can pray. And we'd love it if a whole bunch of you actually wanted to join a missional community and just be part of it. And what that does is it's a very kind of free market in kind of idea, in that you're saying to the leaders, we will support you, encourage you, train you, but you're the ones who are actually responsible for recruiting people. It's not my job to get people into your community, it's your job, but I'll do the very best I can to make that possible for you. So that's what we're going to do. Now, in the kind of 6 weeks run up to that, we're going to be doing some more intentional preaching around some of these themes, so like people of peace and why going is important rather than just saying come to us, and building missional life together. How do you build community? Some kind of stuff that just reinforces those ideas and emphases in the life of the wider church. And then the other thing two other things I want to just mention briefly, then I'm going to pass to Steve, is critical thing in that transition phase is that we're making anyone who wants to start a missional community, they have to have a crystal clear mission vision. In other words, they need to know exactly who it is they're trying to reach. Generally, that will be to a neighborhood or to a network of relationships, so geographically defined or a kind of relationally, or like say that might be a sports team or in the workplace or something like that. Everything is good. There's nothing off limits. So if you want to say, my vision is to reach one-legged pygmies at the National Football Hall of Fame, fantastic, go for it, all right? I have no problem with that. I don't have to own it. You're owning it. And if you can go get those guys and recruit a bunch of people to help you do it, that's brilliant. But what I will do is I will make you be really clear in what your focus is. What we've found over the years is that the clearer the mission vision, the more effective the group will be. So when people come and say, our vision is to love Jesus with all our heart and be nice to everyone in Ohio, well, that's lovely, but it's functionally completely meaningless, all right? So what is it that's going to be the distinctive for your group? Now, that can change over time. It'll evolve, but that's a critical thing for the leaders to have in place. And also I make them say, what's their first 6 month plan going to look like? And again, that's not to lock them in stone, but that's so they don't get to 2 weeks after launch weekend and go, oh, what are we going to do now? It's to give people who want to know about the community in the church life, have a sense of what that might look like to be part of it.
Can you give us a quick example of one of those 6-month plans?
Well, for instance, it's like, what's their pattern of meeting going to look like? They're going to do some kind of more community-focused gathering in a home around a meal and doing stuff like that. But also, what does it look like for them to go out into the community on mission? What are some examples of that might be? Plan the first 2 or 3, perhaps, intentional missional activities so people get a feeling. For instance, they're thinking, can I come with my kids? What will it be like? And, it's questions like that. And I think just making it practical helps people assess quite quickly whether that's something they want to be part of. Okay, good question. And then the very last thing is to say, in this transition process, one of the things that has to be addressed in the church is what are you going to stop or pause in order to allow the new thing to emerge? So an example of that is we have an existing small group structure, which is fairly good. It's not sensational, it's fairly good. So what we're going to be saying to them is, I hope they're not watching this video because we haven't told them this yet, is for that month period of time, yes, live, it's beaming into Ohio. For that kind of month period, roughly, we're going to ask our small groups not to meet in order to give people who are part of the groups, as well as the wider church, space and the energy to actually think about, do they want to be part of a missional community? And then at the end of that month, some of the small groups are totally free to restart or to go en masse to a missional community, or they might actually choose to disband and say, hey, there's a new thing now. What we had was great, but it's come to a natural end. And it's questions like that you're going to have to address in your context. So what are the time-greedy things that you might need to suspend or to stop in order to allow room for that? I realise I've gone a million miles, but I wanted to give you some raw data to chew on, and Steve's going to take it further.
Very good, because it tees me up nicely, Al. Because my guess is that most of you sitting there going, I've scribbled a few thoughts, but how do I do that? And what we'd say is that we brought a whole team of people, and if you ever want to come and have an extended conversation about those things, at our booth down in the main hall, there's a 3DM banner. We've got about 5 or 6 of us that will happily spend as long as you want talking with you about the practical questions you have. Seminars or whatever this is usually kind of get people's interest, but it's really often unsatisfactory in that you've got lots of individual questions. The other thing I'd say is that this field guide, Launching Missional Communities, probably is the most complete from start to finish, both in terms of the theological and the sociological background, right the way down to very practical questions about how do we do the pilot that Alice talked about. What we've really done is said, how can you guys make different mistakes to the ones that we've made over 20 years? So in some ways, it's our best attempt to say, okay, guys, you're always going to have to innovate what it is for your own context. But here are some of the things that we've learnt on the journey that basically will help you in that process. So if you are interested in launching missional communities, if you want to find out more, taking one of these home would be a really good thing to do. And before we do Q&A, I'm just going to give you one lens, because Mike's absolutely right. Most of the churches we work with, most of the leaders, they're used to functioning in the temple arena. They're used to living life of church, usually under the spiritual covering of very mature leaders like you. They're used to running, as it were, programs within the life of the church. And what we find is in America, you're not short of entrepreneurs. I don't know whether you noticed that. If you offer people an opportunity to go and pioneer a new thing, you'll always have a lot of volunteers. However, you will also lose an awful lot of people if you do that, because you're effectively sending them out onto the front line of missional engagement, where they are usually likely to get pretty beaten up and discouraged quite quickly. And with this is the last lens. We often try and create visual things because most people are visual. When you're thinking about this transition from wherever you are now to wherever it is you want to be, it's really important that you kind of remember everything has a triangle or something in our, that any form of discipleship, any way in which you are going to look to multiply your life expertise into the life of those you lead, always requires 3 components. The first is there is always a component of information. You need to be able to share with them, like Alex said, something of the vision of why. Begin to change the vocabulary, simply putting up in out into the vocabulary of that culture. So there's always a component of information transfer, but most of us are very, very good at doing that. It's almost why we're employed. We're very good at giving and delivering information. This is the component that I would really encourage you guys to reflect on, because imitation was an absolutely foundational part of the model of the discipleship Jesus used. So before you contemplate releasing any of your L50 leaders, any of the people you think want to do this thing, ask yourself, do they have enough information? And have they had an opportunity to observe somebody else doing this thing? The reason why a pilot missional community is often incredibly helpful is it gives the kind of the leaders of the church who have usually the most capacity to pioneer new things a chance to invite into relationship with them some of their key L50 leaders who are actually going to be the ones who lead the missional communities. Pilots last for a fixed amount of time because we want to remove the concept that only professionals can run them. It's the lay leaders, the L50 leaders, that we want to empower. But if they don't get a chance to experience it, to see it, to touch it, to taste it, see it, hear it, smell it, it's very, very hard for them to do the last stage, which is, and I never know quite how to spell this one, whether it's one or two ends, innovation. And we're very good often at church at being hugely charismatic in our delivery of information, and then effectively through that sheer charisma and enthusiasm saying, go on then guys, have a go, and wonder why people get discouraged. So when we're looking at making this transition, just to have this lens, which is to say, have I given an opportunity for my leaders to see it happening and therefore be able to imitate something? They're much more likely to be successful if they've had this opportunity when they themselves begin to do what is a natural process, which is to take what's been invested in them and then innovate it, put it into their own skin, and their own missional vision, and their own component of what they're called to do. So hopefully that's a helpful visual lens.
And just so that you have some information on this, we've not got any of the books with us at this conference that deal with this, but it's called Building a Discipling Culture. Steve and I wrote that, and it outlines how to build out a huddle structure in your church, how to create the infrastructure that will enable you to continue to put wheels under your transition.
And come and talk to us.
Yeah. Okay, so feel free to go to our website and find all the material on this. It's weare3dm.com. What I'd like you to do now is have a moment where you just consider if there were a question that you were going to seek to engage with and get us to engage with, what would it be? So we'll just have a few moments quiet. Extroverts, just put the brakes on because we know you can't think without talking. But 50% of the are introverts, and so they'll prefer to be quiet. So we're just going to have a...
I'm going to just mention that because it's got the blog on it. Is that right if you give them out if people want to?
Yeah. Cool. And we'd like you to share that with the person next to you. That's just so the extroverts actually do work out what they're thinking. We'll do that, and then we'll begin to allow that process of Q&A to start. So let's just have a moment, just to let the dust settle. Okay, let's go for some Q&A. Sally's going to join us. She's great at Q&A.
Come on, Sal.
Come on.
I'll run down.
Sir.
Yeah, I'd just like him to say a little bit more in terms of as you're transitioning the church in Ohio. You talked about starting with the staff in terms of huddles.
Yeah.
And then you started talking about 3 missional communities, and from what I understand, huddles come from the missional community. So are those the same people, different people? I kind of got lost in that a little bit.
Okay, what we did was they had an existing thing where every 6 months they'd get all the leaders together in the church, say 300 people or something. And so at the spring, in the fall one I was there as a visitor speaking, and then in the spring one we used that to set the vision for what we're doing for this year. And we said, if you'd like to be one of the kind of pioneers in developing missional communities, if you're interested in that, we'd love you to come to a pilot. And that's how we recruited people for the pilot. But within the pilots, we're doing huddles as a kind of subset, that as a processing place. And the leaders of those huddles are the staff who Hannah and I are huddling. Does that make sense?
So there's a cascade model with huddle where the leaders will huddle their huddle, and the people they're huddling are huddling others. So that you create
Stand in front of you.
Do the huddles then get together to form the missional communities?
It depends on how you want to do it, but our strategy that we've used many times over and hundreds of churches use, we use a strategy called 864. So the senior discipling leader has 8 in their huddle. Each of those people have 6 in theirs. Each of those people have 4 in theirs. If you lay that out, it's quite easy to predict that the people who are the 6s with 4 in their huddle are huddling the leaders within a missional community team. You see what I mean? So, you know, as this person gets out here, who gets just at 4, that those people could easily be the leadership team of a missional community, which means that you've got lots of missional communities with lots of leaders who are tied into a culture of leadership that the senior discipling leader has started. So,
how long is that ongoing once they've already launched the missional communities with those supports? So that's the support stream. How long do you meet with leaders to kind of prepare them, raise them up, before they actually launch out?
I think it depends on the leader. Rule of thumb is 6 months. That's just the rule of thumb.
The 864 that's here, that's the kind of discipleship structure for leaders, but it's often helpful for people to see the skeletal structure of the church. Mike talked earlier about leaders of 10, 50s, 100s. It's often that's the huddle that so each leader of any size of church is effectively both in a huddle and is usually leading a huddle as well. So that's just a visual presentation.
I mean, by church you mean community. Yeah. Very good. So.
Yes, you talk about the importance of language shaping culture, and postmodernism really has highlighted that shaping nature. Of course. So for churches, do you use that language? Do you call these missional communities? Do you distinguish between what you call it internally and what you reference it to people outside come be part of our missional community? Is that different for a established church and a church plant? Do you use the same language all the way across the board, or
one of the things that is important to discover is that human hardwiring is defined by the need for the extended family unit. So really what we're doing with missional community is connecting with human hardwiring that for us in Western culture we've largely become disconnected with, because the best example we've got of family is nuclear family. But the cornerstone of human existence has been the extended family. What that means is that very rapidly, and of course this is what Alex can now predict, but he will certainly see over the next 2 or 3 years, is that the people who join missional communities will see that as their principal identity within the wider church of Rivertree. Because that's their way, the hardwiring works like that. So our suggestion is allow the leaders with the missional vision to describe that missional community by giving it a name. Give it a name. Whatever that name is. It doesn't matter what it is. You can call it peaches and cream if you want to. It doesn't matter what you call it. I mean, we've got the most wild names that we've seen over the years. I mean, nutty names. But it gives you something to invite people to because it's an identity.
There's one rule. You can't use your last name because that's boring.
Yes.
Really boring. Don't do that.
Yes. Do come to the Absalom group. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Really boring.
But it's a description usually. It's a expression usually of a vision.
So do you have suggestions on I mean, you're trying to appeal to outsiders when you do that?
Yeah, just use a lot of innovation. You remember the triangle? That's the thing. You do the information, do the imitation, and then allow the innovation to be part of that.
I'll come to you, but I think all these things, the answer to a lot of questions is defined by your missional context. So you keep that front and centre and you're not going to go too far wrong.
So what do you call it?
Well, I mean, you don't call it hell and brimstone, do you? I mean, because that's probably not very helpful.
Fire and brimstone.
Fire and brimstone, yeah, whatever. So in Oklahoma, actually, it's a long narrative, but actually we just... The way we gathered, these were a bunch of friends in our neighbourhood, and we gathered them by inviting them to a spiritual gathering. And they then started calling it house church. So it was actually group defined, the kind of the label, but it was out of relationships.
Right there. Yeah. And then you've had one question, but then we'll go behind you. Yeah, go.
What are you seeing? So I've read your stuff from really the European experience. What are you seeing in the States in terms of these stalwart individualists who tend to not like small, intimate gatherings, especially when God's involved, if they're outsiders? What are you seeing? Are you seeing them come into?
Yeah. Okay. To answer that, every single example on here is from the States.
Okay.
These are all. This is written from American experience. All right. So that's the first thing to say. And what we've found is that I wouldn't use the term small and intimate to describe a missional community. It's the next scale up, you see. So it's, and we talked about this a bit at the pre-seminar, and we can perhaps do it another day, but in here we talk a lot about the sociology around all that. And actually it's in what sociologists call social space, which is where you're not doing personal, private thoughts, but it's much more kind of snapshots type level. And so it's a much easier context to invite people into, for all sorts of reasons.
It's called the social space sociologically.
Doug, you were going to just
and
correct me.
It's not personal and it's not intimate. You can find personal and intimate space within the social space, but in general, it's a much easier thing to invite people to.
Doug was going to
I
correct
would just
us.
say to help out with that question, because like Mike was saying, most of the extended family experiences are lost for now, but if you're Thanksgiving or Christmas, which tends to be time with extended family, it's very easy to invite people into that who are friends or who aren't even related, and they can participate in that. And there's no pressure to have like intimate conversation with anyone. Like they can engage just over eating or watching football or whatever it might be. And if they do have a deeper conversation, it's because they chose to have it, not because they were cornered into a position where they had
Yeah.
to.
Very good.
Thanks for
When we talked about this with our leadership group and some people in the church, the first response we always get is, wow, how are we going to layer this on top of everything else we're doing in our lives?
Very good.
So what's been your experience in that?
I always say two things really. From the point of view of any corporate group, the best analysis we have is that for you to start something successful, you have to stop something else. So Jim Collins, good to great, absolutely fundamental. You have to go through the inflection point that gets you from good to great without stopping something. So somewhere along the line, we've got to go through the pruning, the repenting, the releasing that is necessary to make space for this. The second thing I'd say is, in the transition towards it, you can invite people into this process by using time and energy that's already being used. So, for instance, if a church has a Wednesday night service that has now become small group night, that's a very common phenomenon. Use that night. If a church has is used to having Sunday school alongside Sunday service as an expectation for a committed member, use that time. Use the times that are available that people have already given themselves to as the starting point to begin the process of explaining and understanding what this all means.
Yeah. But we talk a lot about evolution, not revolution, because in revolutions people die and they're very bloody. So the process of leading change actually takes far longer than most leaders realize. We work with multiple churches now in transitional process that takes years to change this culture. So in some ways they kind of think, oh gosh, if I'm going to change this, how does it work? In fact, building the discipling infrastructure underneath will often take a year before anybody notices any difference. So it's not right, we're going to change. And usually what we do is we try and give opportunity for those groups, which may be small groups or other ministries in the life of the church, to evolve towards a more up-in-out reality. So rather than saying to someone, right, your lot are not missional, you've got to stop, what you say is, let's lovingly reflect together on the opportunity to see Jesus' life as being up in and out. Which would you say was your group's strength? And where might there be an opportunity for the Lord to bless you and grow? Do you know, Pastor?
I'm like a pastor every day.
There you go, thank you.
Right there on the back row.
Okay.
Right on the back row of that.
If missional communities meeting weekly, what would be the general outline of a content of what would happen?
Get the-
Honestly, I know we keep peddling this, but truly,
And there's lots of examples that you can just simply use.
We've got more examples in there than you can shake a stick at.
And I'm blogging about examples as well.
Yeah, we do stuff like that. Who was next? I think it was this gentleman, and then probably that one, and then that one, and then that one. Okay, we'll try and do it
You
quick.
mentioned the metrics of how you measure those who are in discipling relationships.
Yeah.
What are the metrics?
If you count people in huddles, if you did 864, that would be 248 people. If you had 8, and each of those 8 people had 6, and each of those
48.
had 4, it'd be 248, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I guess I'm not speaking about methodology. I'm speaking about how do you define a disciple?
Yep.
Right. Well, so we're saying a
What are the
disciple is a
values?
person who's chosen to be in an intentional relationship where they are being discipled. And so we're creating a metric by that.
Okay.
That would be one way of doing the metric.
And you just measure by whether or not they're in those huddles.
Yeah.
And incidentally, it is the metric that Jesus uses in the Great
Right.
Commission, just as a kind of just right there.
Just a really simple group size question.
Yeah.
First of all, what is kind of optimal group size? And the other one that goes along with that is, it seems to be very different in our experience that when you have young families with a bunch of kids, those group sizes are critical. Can you?
Yeah. So I think you need to get into the 20s in order to get social space really happening effectively, and it breaks the kind of the Christian inertia drag back down to a large small group. So I think there's something about getting above 20. And then the higher level generally will be reached by the size of the room or the house where you are. So that tends to be what the reality is.
Although if you go beyond 70, then it's
Yeah.
already public space.
Yeah, and once you get, and also I think you hit leadership issues. Once you've got to be quite a gifted leader to lead above once you get into the 60s. But generally, most groups will be 20s, 30s, 40s.
Tougher the missional environment, the smaller the unit that's often required, we found.
What we've noticed is in tough inner city environments, missional communities tend to be smaller because it's just harder to do it.
Sorry, what's the other half of your question?
Well, a lot of the missional stories are groups of disaffected young people that come from Starbucks.
Right. Yeah.
And then, here we are launching in a
Yep.
upwardly mobile
Yep.
suburban community
Yep.
with lots, they've got 3 kids each,
Yep.
and we're trying to figure out
Yep.
how to make that work.
Yeah. Okay. So again, there's lots of stuff in the book about how to use kids. The stuff we were doing in Oklahoma was with families, and so it definitely works with families. I think there's different approaches people take. Some people would go for don't have the children involved, pay babysitters, put them in another building with padlocks. Some people would say go the other extreme. Kids are involved in absolutely everything, and some people say kids are involved some of the time, and some of the time it's fine for them to play because their attention span is different. And I think you need to work out what's right for each missional context. I would say it's the missional community leader's decision to make those calls. But personally, I think it's great to do it with kids, and we've involved our boys, and we've watched things happen in our boys' lives and things that come out of their mouths, and we realise they really do get the missional lifestyle far more than it's gone now, but the kind of the big church experience. They really love the missional dynamic.
Can I just say that I think children growing up in a missional community environment hugely benefit from that wider group of people to more variety of parenting. Our children are now in their 20s and they've all grown up through missional communities. And they refer to their family as the extended family that they've grown up in. And for varying reasons, they will refer to other members of this missional community for whatever they need in their life, which is an incredible encouragement. Because I don't believe that I'm a good parent alone. I don't think I can do it all alone. And I think particularly if you are alone, you might be a single parent, which is very common in today's society. You feel less of that aloneness given a missional community and an extended family that you can travel together with.
Okay, that's great, Sal. Any last words, Steve?
Yeah, just to say, guys, I mean, we're here all week. There's the book you can read, but we also know that for many people, they need a chance to engage over an extended period. We've got a free Missional Communities workshop in Pawleys Island by the beach in June. It's totally free. You can come. Basically, if you're interested in that, there's some details in here. But come by us at the booth. Our heart is, whatever questions you've got, wherever you are in your context, if we can serve you in that, we'd love to. We're just aware that a room that's like about 85 degrees for an hour is probably limited in the capacity of what we can do. But thank you so much for your engagement. We're